Are you working on your first book, but you have no idea whether you should self publish, publish traditionally, or find something in the middle? Well, if that describes you, this episode is for you. I'm speaking with Andrea Lynn, who has published multiple books with another on the way, and we are going to get a sneak peek behind the scenes of what it's like to publish traditionally, warts and all. I'm Dr. Amanda Nell Edgar, the CEO and managing editor of Page and Podium Press, and I'm so excited to welcome Andrea Lynn to our show today. I am so excited today to be talking to Andrea Lynn. She is the author of the forthcoming YA novel Dust Spells, and it is romancy and ghosty. It has magic. I have known Andrea for a very long time. But what I want to talk about today is Andrea's publishing journey. There are so many things that she went through that really no one should ever have to go through, but it is fascinating at every turn. So let's just start. Can you walk us through your publishing journey?
Yeah, right out of college, I had a creative writing teacher who was like, "Hey, you should try and get your stuff published because you could." And I was like, "Okay," because I particularly wrote about like women and feminist things. And she's like, "There's women's journals that like want exactly what you're writing." And so for a few years in my early 20s, I submitted short stories to like journals, and I did get a few of those published. They were mostly in, like women's quarterly kind of fiction things. And then when I was like 28, no, it was right after I had my first son. I was like 28 or 29, and I read this book series that's still around, still really good, called A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. And I was like, it was like feminist, and there was magic, and it was history, and there was music, and I was like, I could do this. I could do this. I love this. And so I wrote my first novel and just kind of like went online to figure out like, what do I do? How do I do this? And I got back then, this is like 2011 or 12. And so Twitter was like starting out and being really big. And it was a really great community for writers. It still kind of is, but I mean, what's happening with but I found out about Query Tracker and like websites and different blogs that taught you how to write queries. And so anyway, I started querying, and after about 6 months, I got my first agent, and she uh, signed me. And then about, I think it was probably between 6 and 9 months that she put it on submission to editors, and no one wanted it. And by then I'd written my second book, and it was called The Sound of Beating Wings. And I don't even really want to get into it because I said this in my TikTok. It's the only book that I look back and I'm like, oh, it really wasn't that good, because I was really trying to write to the market at the time. And instead of like writing something genuine and that was about me, that came from my heart. And so everything fell flat, and it was really stereotypical and not very, the characters weren't well developed. But she put it on submission for a while, but no one wanted it for those reasons, which were legit. And so then I'd written a third one. It was called The Heartless City, and it was like this reimagined London where like Dr. Jekyll made his Mr. Hyde medicine, but like a bunch of people took it and they became kind of like zombies. And so a small publishing company wanted it. And so it did get published in 2015. And they were a really great company at the time. They were really professional to work with. They were so small that they didn't give advances or anything. But I didn't care. It even got made into an audiobook that like a real British author read, which is actually still on Audible. The other books are not available anymore, which I'll get into. But by the time the second one was set to come out, the company was not. My agent and I both had noticed that they weren't meeting deadlines, and they weren't responding, and they were not doing things that they used to do. And then I got invited to a Facebook page that had been created by disgruntled authors who had books with the company. And we were all on there, and they're like, some of them were like, my cover's deadline came out and it didn't happen. And someone else is like, my release date came out and it didn't happen. And I was just like, oh my God. And so my agent and I ended up getting the rights back to us like right before they apparently filed for bankruptcy and ghosted all of the authors and just disappeared. So that's why those books don't really exist and aren't in print anymore, except the copies I have, which I guess makes them very valuable.
Yes, it's a limited edition. I love it.
They're in the library at the high school I teach at, so I guess those kids can read it. I wrote a couple more books after that. So after that trilogy that didn't go anywhere, I wrote a book called Dust Girls, and it was like the original version of my book that's going to be coming out in 2024 called Dust Spells Now. It was changed. And my agent wasn't into it, and I wrote another book that was like the first draft of the one that you've read, actually, which has been rewritten a couple times now, and there's actually plans for it eventually. But she wasn't into that, and eventually she basically was like, I don't think I'm serving you as your agent anymore. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table when I got that email, and I like cried immediately. It was very much like being broken up with. But then I was like, well, you know what, she's right, like, we're not succeeding. I don't think we're jiving, and all right, but the idea of having to query again was so awful, but it wasn't as awful as I thought it would be. Like, I was like, oh, I can never go through this again. But I had had a lot of experience by then, and I was better, and I was a better writer, and I knew how things worked better. And I ended up signing with my new agent, who I have now, who I adore. Her, she's wonderful. Her name is Elizabeth Copps, and she loved the Dust Girls book that my agent wasn't feeling. And she also loved this murder ballad one that I had written since then. And so I didn't even in my TikTok go into how. So I went on sub with the Dust Girls version, and it was on sub for a while. And then she was like, well, maybe some of the themes are too adult. Maybe you should rewrite this as an adult romance instead of young adult, because everything I've talked about so far is young adult. And so I did that. I rewrote it as an adult book. And then a lot of the adult responses were like, no, this feels more YA. So I rewrote it again. And then we put it on sub, and then got a book deal with another independent publisher. Camcat is the publishing company that's publishing the book. And so, yeah, that's what's going on.
Well, yeah, this is not on my list of questions, but talk to me a little bit about the relationship with your agent, because what I hear is so much collaborative, strategy-oriented conversation that's happening that I don't think people realize. I think there's such an intimidation factor with an agent. And I think that people forget that you're working with that person and they're working for you.
Yes, exactly. It is a lot like more of a team than any other situation. I mean, she knows what she knows, and she's good at what she's good at. And this was true about my old agent too. Like, I have nothing against her. It just wasn't a thing. She was also very, like, into my work and believed in it.
I love that. Yes, I love that. So I want to jump to the question that I had about creativity versus commercial appeal, because you've touched on that a couple of times, but tell me how you balance between those two demands.
I feel like I feel like there's a lot of different correct answers to this. I think it's different for every person. But like you have to be authentic to the story you want to write, that the story you feel needs to be told. But if there is something that's a problem in it that really would make it not work, you got to listen to that too. And you can't always know that either. You can never write for the market, because the market will have changed by the time your book comes out. Like, a few years ago, it was all dystopian, and everything was Hunger Games and Divergent, and everything's dystopian, and like no one's reading dystopian right now. And we go through phases where it's like historical, and now people are more aware of historical, and contemporary is bigger. And you can't write for the market, because it will have changed by the time the 3 years, 4 years after you've written the book, it gets published. However, listening to the advice of people who watch those things and know those things, like an agent, like, is also important. And knowing it yourself, like, that's the most important thing. I tell my students this all the time. I'm like, if you really want to write and get published, you have to read a lot. You have to know what's out there. You have to know what people are reading now, because I read all the time. And like, every time I'm reading a book, I'm like, oh, I love that. I want to do something like that. Or then I'm like, I don't like how they did that. That's something I will avoid. And that's the most important thing.
it becomes almost part of your instinct.
Yes.
I think even at the line level, if you're reading something now, something that was written, just came out, that's going to have just a really different patter than something that was written in the 1800s. The language is just going to be really
Absolutely.
different. So you have to be reading now because that's what the ear of the market
Exactly.
hears.
And especially in a genre like young adult, because it's always, the youth are always changing and they're faster at what,
absolutely,
at knowing what they want and like what's going on in our culture. And you have to keep up with how it's being done. You just have to.
yeah, absolutely.
But I also think it's organic too, like you were saying, like if you're reading it all the time, that's what's going to come from you. You know, if you're only reading Jane Austen, you're probably going to write like Jane Austen, which is great, but not what is being looked for in the young adult market right now.
So I want to throw a question at you that I did not send you in advance, but so this question of voice gets all tangled up in there because I know, and I think for very good reason, folks just get really sensitive about, I want my voice in there. And especially since we do ghostwriting, people are always questioning, can you really get my voice? We can. But I think defining what your voice is really, really challenging. When you're thinking about how books are written now and what are the base level expectations, do you have any thoughts on how you hone your voice while also thinking about industry expectations?
Wow, that is a good question. Voice is just the hardest thing. Like it's hardest thing to teach in my creative writing classes, to even explain like this is what it is, because sometimes it really feels like you've got a voice that resonates or that fits this or that doesn't, and there's nothing in between. But that's not true. You can write something in a bunch of different voices, is like what I tell my students, like write this recipe in the voice of like a ingenue in a romance novel. Like you can do that. They're fun exercises, but it's a mixture. I guess it's kind of like my other answer in that you need to be true to your voice, but not to the point that you're ignoring any outside perspective, maybe. Because I know in a way it's singing, like there are popular ways of singing, like ways that we consider good singing. Like Broadway stars now don't sound like Broadway stars in the 80s, and they don't sound like the Broadway stars in the 60s. And they're all using their own voices and need to be authentic to their own voices, but you train in a way that needs to stay contemporary and be what people want to hear. So I guess that kind of worked out, that metaphor, is what I'm saying.
I can see that because it's what people want to hear, but people don't want to hear somebody that just sounds literally like everybody else. They want a particular type, a shape of sound, but with your particular unique touch.
I think that's exactly right. You put that perfectly. Like it has to be authentic to you. Like it has to be. You can't make it into something that's cool and popular if that's not how you are. So it's that it at its core, it has to be you. But you being aware of all the different ways that you can stay you and pivot around what needs to be done, I guess.
No, yes, I think that's exactly right. I always use the metaphor of a park with a fence. You would not want to take your kids or your dog to play in a park that didn't have a fence because you wouldn't be able to trust that they would be safe.
I love that.
So they can still play, they can have a great time with that fence there. And I always think of genre expectations or voice expectations with your creativity. A fence is actually really empowering.
Yeah, you don't have to worry. You're like, well, I'm within the fence, and so I can do whatever in here.
Well, so to pivot, one thing that I really want to make sure we get before our time is through is tell us a little bit about what you found the most surprising in your publishing journey, or kind of on the other side of the coin, what advice would you give to authors that are first thinking about querying?
Yeah, to answer both of those, I definitely wish that I'd gone in knowing how often I was going to have to rewrite it and try it again. And that you have to put a lot of work and research into it the first time or it's a waste. I think a lot of people, and I had this idea that like, just throw it out there and see what sticks, but that's never gonna, I mean, maybe that works every once in a while for someone, but the only way to really get listened to is to do the research of like, the best thing for me was following agents on Twitter that would often tweet about what they wanted to see. And some of them would tweet about what they didn't like seeing. And that was helpful, like to know, like, this is what I want. This is what will get my attention. And so much of it was just being treated with genuine respect. I still see that sometimes. They're like, don't be a jerk. Call me by my name. Use the correct pronouns. Like, don't, compare yourself to Harry Potter. Like just like, I would see that a lot. I'm like, people are doing those things, but I guess they are. So a lot of it is just being honest and being respectful and knowing that if it's not for them, then it's not for them. And that's fine. You want to find the person that it's right for. Rejections obviously hurt, and they hurt the most at first, but they're good because, I mean, you want to end up with someone who super duper wants you, like I said, who wants to be that invested in you. And if they don't want you, then you're not the right fit. And then you just got to keep trying. There's no way that if you keep working and studying and listening to advice that you won't get better and that you won't get somewhere. And maybe that book isn't right for this time. Maybe you write another book and you query that. And I know if it's like your first book, that sounds terrible. And you're like, oh no, I can't do this again. But as someone who's written like 11 books, you really can. And that's part of what has kept me going through this is if this is something that you love, then it's not painful to keep trying because you want to keep doing it. I want to write and I'll keep writing. And it's totally legit. I've talked to other writers who are like, I'm so discouraged. I'm so burnt out. I don't want to do this anymore. But I've never felt that way. I've never felt like anything has made me not want to keep writing and not want to keep getting my work out there. And so that's what I just tell myself, like if something were, we signed contracts, but I don't know if something were to happen now and my publishing company was like, never mind, and it ghosted me too, and I just had the worst luck with publishing companies, I'd still keep trying. I'd do it again. And because, like I said, you'll get somewhere. You'll either get with an agent or you'll get published or you'll learn what you need to change in order to get it.
Exactly. So tell us what your next big thing is and where can we follow you to make sure we don't miss your updates?
Well, Dust Spells is going to be released May 7th of 2024 and from CamCat Publishing. On TikTok, I'm Andrea Lynn Writes. I think I'm also that on Instagram and Twitter. I'm still there. And so I'll post updates there all the time. And if you follow me, you'll know when stuff is happening and hopefully be entertained sometimes.
Yes. And your TikTok is so great. So tune in if you have enjoyed this. Check out Andrea Lynn Writes on TikTok. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences, and I know everybody watching has gotten something so valuable from you sharing with us today.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amanda.
And thank you so much to folks watching. If you have found this content enjoyable and valuable, please make sure that you like and subscribe. Tell your friends. We really want to reach as many authors as we can, really to get this message out that you can publish in a way that is completely true to who you are, what you believe, and the story that you want to get out into the world. So thanks so much for joining us today. I will talk to you soon, and happy writing.